The Armada dropped out of hyperspace at exactly midnight Greenwich Mean Time. Fleet Commander had chosen the timing carefully. Half of Earth would be sleeping, and the other half would be watching the sunrise. Neither group would be ready for what came next. 12,000 ships spread across the sky like a dark blanket. They covered every continent, every ocean, every major city. The humans below looked up and saw their sun disappear behind metal and weapons. Some screamed. Some prayed. Most simply stood frozen, unable to understand what their eyes were telling them. Watched the planet rotate beneath his command vessel and felt nothing but confidence. The mathematics were simple, and mathematics never lied. His species numbered 12 billion warriors, each one bred for combat, each one eager to prove their worth. Earth held 8 billion humans, and most of them were soft creatures who had never held a weapon. The invasion projections, calculated by the finest military minds in the Empire, estimated total planetary conquest within 96 standard hours. 4 days to add another world to their collection. It had taken longer to conquer the, and they had actual armies. It had taken longer to break the, and they had natural armor. Humans had neither. They had soft skin, weak bones, and short lives. This would be easy. The first broadcast went out to every screen on the planet, appeared on televisions, phones, and computers across the world. His gray skin and 4 eyes made children cry, but that was fine. Fear was useful. "People of Earth," he said in perfect English, having learned the language during the journey. "Your planet now belongs to the Empire. Resistance is not just futile, it is mathematically impossible. We outnumber your military forces by a factor of 100 to 1. Surrender your weapons, your governments, and your will, and you may continue to exist as servants of the Empire. Resist, and you will be erased." He ended the transmission and waited for the panic to begin. It came quickly. News channels showed crowds running through streets, cars crashing into each other, people fighting over supplies in stores. This was normal. This was expected. Every species reacted the same way when faced with superior force. What happened next was not normal. Within 6 hours, the governments of Earth began to surrender. First came a small island nation, then a European country, then several more. White flags appeared on military bases. Generals sent messages of total capitulation. Cities broadcast their willingness to submit to rule. By the end of the first day, over 60% of Earth's nations had officially surrendered. Found this suspicious. They had fought for 3 years before surrendering. They had never surrendered at all, choosing extinction over submission. Yet these humans, these supposedly intelligent creatures, were giving up after a single day. He ordered his ground forces to land and begin the occupation. They touched down in every major city, expecting to find terrified civilians lining up for registration. They found exactly that. Humans smiled at them nervously, offered them food and water, showed them to government buildings, and handed over lists of military assets. It was too easy. Felt an itch at the back of his mind, a warning from instincts honed over centuries of warfare. Something was wrong. The reports started coming in during the second day. A patrol of 50 warriors had gone to inspect a military base in a place called Nevada. They never returned. Another group had entered a city called Moscow to establish a command post. They vanished without a trace. A battalion of 3,000 had been sent to secure something called the Pentagon. Only their equipment was found, arranged neatly in rows, with no bodies and no explanation. Demanded answers. His intelligence officers had none to give. The humans they interrogated seemed genuinely confused. They knew nothing about missing patrols. They had surrendered completely. They were cooperating fully. Why would they harm their new masters? By the end of the first week had officially declared Earth conquered. The planet was now part of the Empire. Ceremonies were held. Flags were raised. Celebrations occurred on the billions of light years away. By the end of the second week, understood that he had conquered nothing at all. His forces continued to disappear. Not in large battles, not in glorious combat, but in ones and twos and small groups. A warrior would walk down a street and never reach the other end. A transport would enter a tunnel and never exit. A patrol would investigate a building and simply cease to exist. There were no bodies, no evidence, no witnesses, just absence. The humans continued to smile. They continued to cooperate. They answered questions politely, followed orders promptly, and showed no signs of resistance. When ordered public executions to punish the invisible attackers, the crowds watched in silence and then went home to cook dinner. He began to study human history then, trying to understand what he was facing. What he found disturbed him more than any battle ever had. Humans had spent their entire existence fighting each other. They had fought over land, over resources, over ideas, over things so small and petty that could not even understand them. They had invented thousands of ways to kill each other, and then they had invented thousands of ways to kill each other without being caught. They had a concept called guerrilla warfare, where small groups attacked larger forces and then disappeared. They had something called terrorism, where individuals sacrificed themselves to cause fear. They had assassins, spies, saboteurs, and something particularly troubling called double agents, people who pretended to serve one side while secretly working for another. They had conquered 37 worlds, and on every one of them warfare had been straightforward. Armies met armies. The stronger force won. The weaker force surrendered or died. There were rules, traditions, expectations. Even the most primitive species understood that war was fought between soldiers. Humans did not understand this. To humans, everyone was a soldier. Every person was a potential weapon. Every smile hid potential teeth. Called a meeting of his senior commanders. They gathered in the massive chamber of his ship, their gray faces showing the first signs of doubt. "We have lost 4,000 warriors in 2 weeks, announced. Not in battle, not in any confrontation we can identify. They simply disappeared. The humans claim to know nothing, one commander said. Of course they claim to know nothing. They are lying. How can you be certain? Pulled up a historical document on the main screen. It showed a conflict from human history called the Vietnam War, where a small, poor nation had defeated one of the most powerful militaries on the planet. Not through superior force, but through patience, deception, and an absolute refusal to fight fairly. They have done this before, said. They have done this to each other. A species that will use these tactics against its own kind will certainly use them against us. Then we increase security. We patrol in larger groups. We trust no one. And how do we occupy a planet when we trust none of its inhabitants? How do we control 8 billion people who smile at us while planning our deaths? No one had an answer. That knight received a message on his personal communication device. It should have been impossible. The device was secured with encryption, accessible only to the highest ranks of the Empire. Yet somehow, someone had broken through. The message contained only text, written in perfect script. You have more soldiers, we have more patience. Shall we see which runs out first? Trace the message to its source. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It came from 1,000 different locations simultaneously. It came from devices that should not have been able to send it. He stared at the words for a long time. In all his centuries of war, he had never felt what he felt now. It was not fear exactly. It was something worse. It was the realization that he was fighting an enemy he did not understand, an enemy that did not fight the way enemies were supposed to fight, an enemy that had already adapted to his presence while he was still trying to understand theirs. The next morning, he ordered triple patrols, extensive surveillance, and mandatory registration of all humans. His forces would control this planet through sheer presence. They would watch every street, every building, every room. The humans lined up for registration with the same cooperative smiles they had worn since the beginning. They answered every question, provided every document, followed every rule. They were the perfect conquered people. And somewhere, in places could not find, they were planning something he could not imagine. On the celebrated their 38th conquest. On Earth, the humans waited. They had been waiting for a long time. They had gotten very good at it. General Maria Santos sat in a bunker beneath the Swiss Alps, surrounded by screens showing every movement on the planet. She was 63 years old and had spent 30 of those years studying how the weak defeated the strong. She had written books about insurgencies in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and a dozen other places where superior force had meant nothing. Now she was putting those lessons into practice. "Report," she said to the shadows around her. Voices answered from the darkness. Representatives from every nation, every military, every intelligence agency. They had been preparing for this since the first alien ship was detected approaching the solar system 3 years ago. They had planned for every scenario. They had hoped for peace. They had prepared for war. "Phase 1 is complete," someone said. "They think they have won." Santos nodded. That was the most important part. Let the enemy think they have already won. Let them relax. Let them spread out. Let them believe the fight is over. Then show them it has just begun. "Begin Phase 2, she ordered. Across the planet, in cities and villages and forests and deserts, humans received the signal. They continued to smile at their occupiers. They continued to cooperate fully. But now they had permission to do what humans did best. They began to fight dirty. General Maria Santos had spent 30 years studying a simple truth that most people never understood. Wars were not won by the strongest army. They were won by the side that wanted victory more and was willing to do whatever it took to achieve it. The wanted conquest. They wanted to add another planet to their empire, another trophy to their collection. They wanted to win and move on to the next target. Humans wanted survival. They wanted their homes, their families, their world. They were not fighting for glory or expansion. They were fighting because the alternative was extinction. Santos knew which motivation was stronger. From her bunker beneath the Alps, she coordinated what appeared to be random acts of chaos. A transport crashed here. A supply depot caught fire there. A patrol walked into an ambush in some forgotten corner of the world. Each incident seemed unconnected to the others. Each one could be explained away as accident, equipment failure, or bad luck. But there were no accidents. There was no bad luck. Every incident was planned, approved, and executed with careful precision. The goal was not to kill. The goal was to break their minds. She called it the death of 1,000 cuts. Each wound was small, almost insignificant, but together over time they would bleed the enemy dry. The first major operation was called Silent Morning. Santos had studied biology extensively, using tissue samples captured from the early disappearances. She learned that their species was highly sensitive to certain chemical compounds that had no effect on humans. One of these compounds existed naturally in a common Earth plant. Within weeks, that compound was being added to water supplies across the occupied territories. The doses were tiny, far below what would cause immediate harm, but they accumulated in tissue, causing headaches, confusion, and paranoia. Soldiers who had been confident and aggressive became jumpy and suspicious. They started seeing threats everywhere. The medical officers eventually identified the contamination, but by then the damage was done. Warriors no longer trusted local water. They had to import everything from their ships, stretching supply lines thin and making them even more vulnerable. The second operation targeted communication. Human hackers, working in cells scattered across the globe, began infiltrating systems. They did not do anything obvious. They did not crash servers or delete data. Instead, they made small changes, tiny alterations that were almost impossible to detect. A patrol report would be delayed by a few hours. A supply request would be rerouted to the wrong destination. An intelligence assessment would contain subtle errors that seemed plausible but led to wrong conclusions. The information network, which had always been perfectly reliable, began to develop cracks. Commanders started receiving conflicting reports. They no longer knew which information to trust. They began second-guessing themselves and each other. The third operation was the most psychologically devastating. Santos called it Friendly Faces. They had conquered many worlds, but they had never faced a species that could lie so well. Other species showed their deception through body language, through vocal patterns, through subtle cues that trained observers could detect. Humans had evolved differently. They had spent thousands of years lying to each other, and they had gotten very good at it. Under Santos's direction, human operatives began befriending soldiers. They offered gifts, shared meals, learned their language, and showed genuine interest in their culture. They formed real connections, real relationships. Some warriors began to see certain humans as trustworthy, even as friends. Then, at carefully chosen moments, those friends betrayed them. A warrior would confide in a human about patrol routes, and the next patrol would be ambushed. Another would mention supply shipments, and the supplies would disappear. A third would share personal information, and that information would be used against him in ways that seemed impossible. The message spread through the occupation force like a virus. Trust no human. They will smile at you while reaching for a knife. They will share your food while poisoning your water. They will call you friend while planning your death. Fleet Commander watched his army fall apart from the inside. He brought in more troops, thinking that additional numbers would solve the problem. They did not. More troops only meant more targets, more soldiers to feed and supply and protect, more minds to break. He implemented harsh punishments for any act of resistance. Public executions, mass detentions, collective punishment for entire communities. On every other world, such measures had crushed opposition quickly. Fear was a powerful tool. On Earth, it had the opposite effect. Every execution created martyrs. Every detention created empty homes that became safe houses for resistance fighters. Every collective punishment united communities that had been divided before. The harder pushed, the harder the humans pushed back. And they never stopped smiling. That was what disturbed him most. Other species showed their hatred openly. They cursed their conquerors, spat at them, glared at them with obvious rage. Humans did none of these things. They remained polite, cooperative, helpful. They answered questions with apparent honesty. They followed orders with apparent willingness. But behind those friendly faces, something dark was always working. Tried a different approach. He ordered his forces to win hearts and minds, as humans called it. They would show that rule was beneficial. They would improve infrastructure, provide advanced technology, offer opportunities for collaboration. Surely some humans could be genuinely won over. Some could, or at least they appeared to be. Humans volunteered to work with the occupation, to serve as translators and administrators and liaisons. They helped the understand local customs, navigate complex social structures, identify potential troublemakers. Rewarded these collaborators generously. He held them up as examples of what cooperation could achieve. He believed he was building a network of loyal servants who would help pacify their own people. He was wrong. The collaborators were playing a deeper game. They fed the exactly what they wanted to hear, building trust slowly and carefully. They identified true resistors and warned the occupation about them, sacrificing pawns to protect queens. They rose through the administrative ranks, gaining access to more sensitive information with each promotion. And when the time was right, they would betray everything at once. Santos monitored these double agents carefully, knowing that the operation required perfect timing. Too soon and the would recover. Too late and the collaborators might be discovered. She waited, watching, planning, adjusting. Meanwhile, the small cuts continued. A ship crashed due to mechanical failure that was not actually mechanical failure. A commander received intelligence about a resistance cell and sent troops to raid it, only to find an empty building while another squad was ambushed elsewhere. A supply convoy was stopped at a checkpoint manned by human collaborators who smiled politely and waved them through into an area where the roads had been secretly weakened. Began to crack. He spent hours reviewing reports, trying to find patterns in the chaos. There had to be a central command somewhere, a leader coordinating these attacks. If he could find and destroy that center, the resistance would collapse. But there was no center, not in the way he understood. The resistance operated in cells that knew nothing about each other. Orders came through channels that changed constantly. Leadership was distributed, redundant, impossible to decapitate. Santos was important, but she was not essential. If she died tomorrow, a dozen others were ready to take her place. They had never faced anything like this. Their own military was hierarchical, with clear chains of command and centralized decision-making. They could not comprehend an organization that had no head to cut off, no heart to stab, no single point of failure. 18 months into the occupation, received a message from the Emperor wanted to know why Earth was consuming so many resources. Other worlds had been in weeks. Why was this one different? Did not know how to answer. He could not explain to the Emperor that he was fighting shadows, that his enemy was everywhere and nowhere, that he was losing a war that his own people did not even know was being fought. He sent back a report claiming that pacification was proceeding on schedule. He lied to his emperor, something he had never done before. But what choice did he have? Admitting failure was unthinkable. The next day, 3 more patrols disappeared. In her bunker, Santos received the latest reports and allowed herself a small smile. Phase 2 was working better than expected. The enemy was confused, demoralized, and starting to make mistakes. Their information networks were compromised, their supply lines were strained, and their soldiers were jumping at shadows. It was almost time for Phase 3. She turned to Dr. James, who had been working in a corner of the bunker for the past year. His laboratory was small, cramped, and filled with equipment that had been smuggled from universities around the world. "How close are we?" she asked. Looked up from his microscope with tired eyes. "Close. Another month, maybe 2, but I need more samples." "You will have them." Nodded and returned to his work. He was creating something that had never existed before, a weapon that would not kill but would destroy nonetheless. It would turn the greatest strength into their greatest weakness. Santos turned back to her screens. The occupation continued above her, thousands of alien soldiers trying to control a planet that refused to be controlled. They still outnumbered humanity. They still had superior technology, superior weapons, superior everything. But they did not have superior patience. They did not have superior cunning, and they did not have superior will. The humans were fighting a war that did not even recognize as war, and they were winning. Dr. James had not slept in 3 days. His eyes burned, his hands shook, and his mind kept wandering to places it should not go. But he could not stop now. He was too close. The laboratory hidden in the abandoned subway tunnels of Seoul was cramped and dark, lit only by the glow of computer screens and biological scanners. Equipment lined every wall, most of it jury-rigged from components smuggled through occupied territories at enormous cost. 3 of his assistants had been captured and executed during those smuggling operations. Their faces haunted him in the rare moments when he tried to rest. But their sacrifice would not be in vain. Held up a vial containing a clear liquid. It looked like water. It was not water. It was 18 months of work, 200 failed experiments, and the combined knowledge of the greatest biological scientists humanity had ever produced, all condensed into 50 milliliters of modified protein chains. He called it the equalizer. General Santos called it their final card. If they ever learned of its existence, would probably call it something much worse. The science was actually quite elegant. Neural pathways were structured differently from human ones. They processed information through chemical signals that had no equivalent in Earth biology. Had spent the first year simply understanding how those pathways worked, mapping the alien brain one synapse at a time. Then he had learned how to break it. The equalizer was not lethal. Santos had been very clear about that requirement. Killing would only breed more soldiers, more invasion fleets, more revenge. Humanity could not defeat the entire empire. They could only convince the empire that Earth was not worth the trouble. Dead soldiers created martyrs. Broken soldiers created fear. The equalizer targeted the neural pathways responsible for threat assessment. Once introduced into a system, it would slowly rewire those pathways, causing the brain to perceive threats that did not exist. Every shadow would seem dangerous. Every ally would seem suspicious. Every moment would feel like the one before an attack. The effect would be permanent and incurable. The affected would spend the rest of their lives in a state of constant paranoia, unable to trust anyone or anything, not even themselves. Transmitted his results to Santos through a secure channel that bounced through 17 different relay points before reaching its destination. Her response came within minutes. Production begins immediately. Target date is the anniversary. Understood. The anniversary of the invasion was 3 weeks away. They were planning celebrations, demonstrations of power meant to show the humans that resistance was futile. Instead, it would be the day everything changed. Production was the hardest part. The equalizer required specific conditions to remain stable, and it had to be deployed through methods that would ensure maximum distribution. His team worked around the clock, synthesizing the compound in batches small enough to avoid detection, but numerous enough to affect millions of targets. Distribution was handled by the network of collaborators that had spent 18 months building trust with the occupation. These men and women had smiled at soldiers, learned their names, shared their food, and earned their confidence. Now they would use that confidence to destroy them. The plan was simple in concept and nightmarishly complex in execution. The equalizer would be introduced into the food and water supplies of every major installation simultaneously. By the time the first symptoms appeared, it would already be too late. Fleet Commander spent the days before the anniversary preparing his demonstration of power. He would parade his forces through every major city, showing the humans the futility of resistance. He would broadcast speeches about the benefits of rule. He would prove that the empire was here to stay. He did not notice that his senior staff seemed slightly nervous. He did not notice that the human collaborators were more helpful than usual, more eager to assist with preparations. He did not notice the small changes in his own thinking, the way his mind kept returning to imagined threats and unlikely dangers. The equalizer had already begun to spread. The anniversary dawned bright and clear across most of Earth. Forces assembled in parade formations, their armor gleaming, their weapons polished. Crowds of humans gathered to watch, their faces showing the same cooperative expressions they had worn for 18 months. Stood on a reviewing platform in the center of what had been called New York City. His senior commanders surrounded him, their posture proud and confident. Above them, ships darkened the sky in a display of overwhelming force. The parade began. Warriors marched in perfect formation, their footsteps synchronized, their movements precise. It was a beautiful demonstration of discipline and power. Then something strange happened. A commander in the third rank suddenly stopped marching. He was looking at the warrior beside him with an expression of deep suspicion. A moment later, he drew his weapon and pointed it at his fellow soldier. "Traitor," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent plaza, "I see what you are." The accused warrior stepped back in confusion. "What are you talking about? We have served together for years." Lies, you are one of them, one of the human spies. Other warriors began to react. Some moved to restrain the accusing commander. Others began looking at their companions with new eyes, wondering if the accusation might be true, watched in horror as discipline began to crack. It happened everywhere at once. In Moscow, a battalion commander ordered his troops to arrest their own officers. In Tokyo, soldiers began shooting at shadows that were not there. In London, an entire brigade turned on itself, each warrior convinced that the others had been compromised. Screamed orders into his communicator, but no one was listening anymore. His officers were too busy watching each other, too paranoid to focus on anything else. The perfect demonstration of power had become a demonstration of chaos. The humans watched it all with those same calm expressions. Some of them were smiling now, small smiles that meant nothing to their observers but everything to each other. General Santos watched through hidden cameras as the empire tore itself apart. Her planning had been perfect. The distribution had been precise. The timing had been exact. Now all she had to do was wait. The paranoia spread faster than she had expected. The equalizer was doing its work, but it was being amplified by something she had not anticipated: the command structure itself. Officers who were affected made decisions based on their delusions, and those decisions created real consequences that seemed to confirm the delusions of others. A ship captain, convinced his crew was plotting against him, ordered them confined to quarters. His second-in-command, equally paranoid, interpreted this as evidence that the captain was the real traitor. Weapons were drawn. Shots were fired. Within hours, the ship was a drifting wreck, destroyed not by humans but by its own crew. Similar scenes played out across the occupation force. The military machine, which had conquered 37 worlds through coordination and discipline, collapsed into fragments of isolated, terrified individuals who trusted no one. Watched his empire crumble from the bridge of his flagship. He had ordered the ship into orbit, away from the chaos below. Hopping that distance would provide clarity. It did not. He could not trust his own bridge crew. He could not trust his commanders on the ground. He could not trust the reports coming through his communication systems. Everything felt like a lie, a trap, a deception designed to destroy him. Some part of his mind recognized that these feelings were not natural. Some part understood that he had been affected by the same weapon as his troops, but that knowledge did not help. Understanding that his paranoia was artificial did not make it feel any less real. A message arrived from the Emperor wanted to know what was happening. Ships had stopped responding. Reports had ceased. The entire Earth expedition had gone dark. Stared at the message for a long time. How could he explain what had happened? How could he describe a defeat that had occurred without a single human raising a weapon? He composed his response carefully, each word feeling like a confession. Earth cannot be held. Withdraw all forces immediately. This world is poison. He added a warning that he knew would spread across the galaxy. Do not return. Do not engage. The humans cannot be conquered because they cannot be trusted to stay conquered. They smile while they kill. They cooperate while they plan destruction. They defeated us without fighting us. They broke us from the inside. The surviving forces began their evacuation. It was chaotic, undisciplined, nothing like the precise military operation that had delivered them to Earth 18 months before. Ships collided as paranoid captains refused to coordinate. Warriors fought each other for places on transports. The mighty armada that had darkened Earth's skies fled like scattered prey. Santos watched them go with satisfaction and exhaustion. She had spent most of her life preparing for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she felt mostly empty. The cost had been enormous. Millions had died during the occupation. Cities had been destroyed. Cultures had been wounded in ways that would take generations to heal. But humanity had survived. That was what mattered. She emerged from her bunker for the first time in 18 months, blinking in the sunlight of a free world. Around her, people were beginning to celebrate, their careful masks finally falling away to reveal the joy beneath. Stood beside her, looking as tired as she felt. Did it work the way you expected? Better and worse. She watched a group of children running through a nearby field, their laughter carrying on the wind. We broke them, James. We broke an entire army without firing a shot. What does that make us? Survivors. Is that enough? He did not answer. Perhaps there was no answer. Across the galaxy, they carried their warning to other species, other empires, other worlds that might have designs on the small blue planet. They spoke of humans in hushed tones, describing creatures that could not be trusted, that smiled while plotting destruction, that weaponized deception itself. The galaxy learned to give Earth a wide berth. Other species had been conquered. Other species had been destroyed. But no species had ever defeated the way humans had, not through superior force but through superior cunning. Humanity had earned its place among the stars, not as conquerors, but as the species no one dared to conquer again. Years later, when the first human ships ventured beyond their solar system, they found allies instead of enemies. The galaxy had decided that it was better to work with humanity than against them. Trade agreements were signed. Knowledge was shared. A new era began. And everywhere humans went, they carried the same lesson they had taught: the numbers won battles, technology won battles, force won battles. But cunning won wars. And no species in the galaxy would ever forget it.